Today's date is November 21st, 2013. Ironically, just one day before the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. We're recording this interview for the Freedom Area Historical Society at the home of Jean and Margaret Ann Randerson today. And Jean and Margaret Ann, thank you for your willingness to share your story with us.
Okay.
We're sure that you hold a treasure trove of information about your family's history and your life experiences. There is no doubt that as time passes, this record will be an increasingly valuable snapshot in time enjoyed not only by your family but also by untold generations to come. We'll get started by asking you each to say and spell your name.
Okay, I'm Margaret Ann Garvey Randerson, Margaret Ann Garvey Randerson.
My name is Eugene Randerson, but I go by the name of Gene, G-E-N-E-R-A-N-D-E-R-S-O-N.
And Margaret, I think we'll probably start a little bit more with your background here, and then we'll bring Jean's early family recollections in a little bit later. So Margaret Ann, what were your parents' names?
My father was Joseph E. Garvey, and my mother was Cordelia Mary Geenan Garvey.
Okay, now Margaret, let's head way back in time. Turn on the Wayback Machine, as they would say. And tell us about the family lore, going back as far as you've heard it, as old dad, as I read about.
My father's family, the old dad came from Ireland, and he brought with him 5 sons. The wives stayed behind, or those that were married, and they settled first in Ohio and then came up to Freedom. The old dad established the farm over on Center Valley Road, and between him and his 5 sons, they built houses and cabins for the family. And to this day, that farm is still owned by my brother Joseph D. Garvey. Over the years, the old dad's sons were John L., Michael, Patrick, James. Anyway, my grandfather was John L. And John L. married Margaret Conlon when she came from Ireland. And they settled there on the farm, and they farmed there all of their years. John L. died a number of years before Granny Garvey died. And my father lived with her then until he married my mother. And then he lived on that farm for all of those years until he died there. My parents were married in 1926, and my mother passed away young when she was 42 years old, leaving behind my brother, myself, and an infant baby brother.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your mother's side, the Geenan side of the family, Margaret Ann?
Well, my mother's father was J. Henry Geenan, and her mother was Johanna Burkeis Geenan. They both were from Holland, or their families were from Holland. I know specifically that Grandma Geenan, Johanna's family, came to Combined Locks, and their home was where the Appleton Papers guest house was. That was where they lived. And if you go there, you'll find a picture of Grandma and all of her family there. And they were spread out all over the valley. She had sisters married to Kilsdunks, to Van Handels, to and then to Geenan and whatever. Our daughter now lives in Burkeis Plots over there in Combined Locks, and that was part of their farm originally. Grandma and Grandpa Geenan had a farm on S, and they lived there all their married life, and they raised a family there. There was a George, a John, an Ed, a William, and my mother was an only girl. George died at about 40 years old. John died from diabetes when he was about 16. Ed lived to be elderly in that same house and died there. Bill Geenan moved to Appleton, married somebody when he met in college, and he was an attorney in Appleton. And his children, some of them are still there, some are not there. My Grandma Geenan died when I was about 14 years old. Grandpa Geenan died when I was 5, so I don't remember much about him. But I do remember Grandma Geenan sitting in her rocking chair and watching out the window, and I remember going over there and helping her sometimes with different things in her house. She always wore a long black dress, and she had her hair in a pug, not like the grandmas look today. I don't think that when my children look at me as a grandma, they wouldn't even recognize what my grandma looked like. Grandpa Geenan, I just remember him being a very, very small man, very dedicated to his farm, to his family. And like I said, he died when I was about 5 years old, so I don't remember much about him.
Okay. Well, across the road almost now is the Garveys. Your dad is growing up on his family farm, and your grandfather was John L., and your father was Joseph E. So Grandma and Grandpa really grew up almost as next door neighbors.
That's right.
Yeah. And so, do you know much about your dad's early years as he worked on the farm and went to school and things like
Well,
that?
he was the last of 12 children, and there's a little story about his name that I know is true. He had several brothers that were named John. Every time someone was born in the family, boy, they named him John, after John L. and after the old dad. All of those Johns passed away. He had a number of little sisters that passed away, and they had diphtheria. And the story goes that there were 4 or 5 children that died in 1 week from diphtheria. Anyway, when my father came along as the youngest of that family, they called him Joseph because they were worried about that name John. A little bit of Irish, whatever, that they thought that something might happen to him. So John was a very popular name in my dad's family. He had 4 sisters that lived. Bedelia was the oldest, and she married a man by the name of James Newcomb, had 2 children, Ignato and John Newcomb. And then there was Marcella, married Martin Verhoeven. There was Margaret that married William Stuffle. And there was Mame that married Peter Watry. My father stayed on the farm with his mother after his father died and ran the farm with her. And then his sister Bedelia Newcomb passed away when her children, Ignato and John, were 4 years old and 18 months old. John Newcomb and Ignato came to live at the farm with my dad and their grandmother. And they lived there until they got married. My father and my mother got married. They weren't young. I think my father was almost 30 years old when he got married. And by that time, his mother was very, very old. And she got sick and she went to Appleton and she died at the home of Marcella Verhoeven's. But she had lived there on the farm with him until that time. And then my dad and mother just started to raise their family there. I had an older brother, John E. Garvey. Passed away when he was 31 years old of diabetes, which he acquired when he was 5 years old. I have a kid brother yet. Joseph is 7 years younger than I am, and he still lives over on that family farm, although he does not farm it. And then we were 7 years apart. John was 7 years older than me, and then my kid brother is 7 years younger than I am. Kind of a strange situation. When Joe was born, my mother was all set to get up and get going again when she contracted a strep infection. And she did not die in childbirth, but she died 10 days later, leaving my father with a 14-year-old diabetic child, a little 7-year-old girl, and an infant. My infant brother Joe went to live with my dad's sister, Mame Watry. And he was there for about 2 years, and we had housekeepers at our house. Daddy was very, very good to us, very attentive to us. I can't ever remember him being away from us. He also had a government job where his office was in Appleton, and he was gone during the day, and he had hired hands on the farm to do farm work. Anyway, John died when he was 31, and I was this little girl and my dad was so protective of me. I rode in the car many times with him when he was out on his business with this job because he wouldn't want to leave me home with anybody. And Joe came home to live with us as a family when he was 2 years old, when we had a housekeeper that was ready to take care of a little boy. And various housekeepers, and we had them until I was 14, John was 21, and Joe must have been 7, of course. And our story goes that our housekeeper would not let Joe listen to Billy the Brownie on radio. And we didn't like that, and our dad was at his office in Appleton. And we decided that we didn't need a housekeeper anymore if she wasn't going to be good to Joe. So between John and I, we asked her to pack her things, and she was ready to leave when our father got home from the office that night. So from John 21, myself 14, and Joe 7, we never had housekeepers anymore. We kind of took over. I took over the house, and John, being not very well, was very good at ironing and taking care of things in the house as well. So that we wanted to protect our little brother and that he was not in any way deprived of anything that he wanted to do because of, I guess mostly because of losing our mother. And that was the thing with my father. Most holidays, celebrations were kind of, now I wouldn't say sad, but there was always a little bit of a cloud over all of those things because mother was not there and my dad missed her terribly and never got over that. I need to make a correction on that previous part. My mother and father were married in 1923, not 1926.
Margaret Ann, we've touched on it a little bit before, but I want to go back and learn some more about your childhood before Gene Randerson comes along into the picture. You know, after your mother passed away, you talked about it, life had to be a lot different at the Garvey household. And I'm just wondering about your school years. Can you share a little bit with us, you know, the workings of the farm a little bit more perhaps, and more importantly, your schooling all the way through, if you could share that with us.
Okay, well I was born on June 1st, 1931, on the farm on Center Valley Road in the farmhouse. And my first 5 or so years had to be the happiest of all because mother and daddy were both there. And then when I was 5 years old, my parents decided to tear down the old farmhouse and build a new house. So we lived in a little makeshift, they didn't have trailers then, but something like that. We lived in that until the new house was built and then moved into that. It was one of the first houses in Freedom that had an electric kelvinator, electric stove, built-in cupboards, running water, a bathroom. Before that we had outdoor plumbing, of course, like everybody else. And then when I was 7, my kid brother was born. 10 days later my mother passed away, which changed our life completely. Especially my father never really got over it, but was very good to us. I went on to St. Nicholas School, and I was there for 8 years, taught by the Notre Dame nuns, and I never remember getting hit by a ruler, like so many tales go. Maybe they were just, you know, ignoring me and not hitting me when I should have been. Anyway, in my first and second grade, I had Sister Corella. 3rd and 4th grade, I had Sister Liberta. 5th grade, I had Sister Charlene, one of my very favorite teachers and nuns that I've ever known, and I kept in touch with her until she died just a few years ago. In the 6th and 7th grade, I had Sister Norbertine. In the 8th grade, I had Sister Valentine, or Valentine, however, I think they pronounced it Valentine at that time. While we were at St. Nick's, we played outside every day. We slid on the ice in the winter, and we played games in the summer. We used outdoor plumbing there. The nuns used to come out and play with us on the playground. We played baseball and things like that. Jump rope a lot. Red Rover, come over, you know, and all of those kid games. And then our lunches were eaten in the classroom. They were packed usually at home the night before or something like that. I went home for lunch sometimes because my brother John was diabetic and had to be taken home for lunch many times. So I would go home for lunch sometimes and then come back. as we moved through the grades, I made First Communion, Solemn Communion. We went to Mass every day that we were there in school. It wasn't like now that they go once a week, but we went to Mass every day. The nuns were excellent, excellent, excellent teachers. I think that we learned as much in those 8 years as you could have learned through high school. After our pastor, the pastor that I remember most was Father A.W. Van Dyke when we were there. He used to go to Florida in the winter, and when he came back, we always had to sing a song to him and welcome him back. And he'd come to the classrooms. And then I moved on to high school, to Freedom High School. I went there for 4 years, and we only could choose 4 classes because there were only 4 teachers. So and some of the teachers doubled up. During high school, I did the normal things. I was in much, most things that were like musicals and things like that. I was not an athlete. I was not a cheerleader or anything like that. I was a singer. I was a little bit of an actor. My grades were good. My teachers were, Bob Bachhuber was our principal, and we had a Mr.
Truesdale.
Who did we have?
Truesdale.
Mr. Truesdale. Mrs. Downs was our English teacher. Is that 4?
Mrs. Wolfgram or Mrs.
And Mrs. Wolfgram was there. Our Phi-Ed was playing, games and things like that. We didn't have special Phi-Ed. We had an English class, a science class, a math class, and a commercial class, usually with typing or bookkeeping or something like that. You didn't have the choices that they have nowadays. At home during those years, I was chief cook and bottle washer. I took care of the house. I took care of cooking with the help of my father and my brothers and whatever. My father was very, very interested in education. So when I was finished with high school, he said, I don't care if you ever work, but I want you to go to college. And I was the only person from my high school graduating class, which was small anyway, that went on to college. I was enrolled at Mount Mary in Milwaukee to go and start there. But over that summer, I decided I didn't want to go there because I didn't want to leave my dad and my brothers. So I said, I'll go to school, but I'll go to Outagamie County Teachers College. I wanted to be a teacher anyway. You only had 2 choices in our days. You could be a nurse or a teacher, so I decided I wanted to be a teacher. So I went to the Outagamie County Teachers College, which was called the Normal School at that time in Kokota. And my father, of course, put me in a new car so that I could drive back and forth every day. I finished there in 1951 and went on to teach for 4 years on the Oneida Indian Reservation at the Oneida State Graded School. During that time, I continued my education at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, summers and night school and things like that. Anyway, after those 4 years were done, Jean and I were married. I had known Jean ever since high school, but we never dated until I was in county college. So we got married in 1955, moved to Columbus, Ohio, where he was stationed in the Air Force. And while I was there, I taught 2nd grade at Whitehall Elementary School, which was a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. I came home sooner than I thought I would because my brother John was dying, and I was expecting Mary, our first child. While we were in Columbus, though, I did go on a little bit to school again, and I took a few graduate courses at the University of Ohio State. Came back to Wisconsin, raised our family here. I quit teaching for 15 years. But during those years, I kept my finger in education a little bit by going on to school, and I regraduated from Oshkosh with a degree including psychology. Anyway, we had 7 children, or 6 children in 7 years. I got to correct that. 6 children in 7 years, and we moved into this house the year that Tom, our 2nd child, was born. Before that, we lived with my dad over at the farm after Jean was out of the service. Well, we raised those 6 children here, and during that time, somewhere along the line, somebody asked me to substitute teach. So I did that for a little bit, and then, of course, Bill Van Lannen was our superintendent here, and his wife was a friend of mine. And he called one day and he said he needed a sub. And I wasn't very nice because I hadn't told him I was a teacher. So I said, well, I haven't been in a classroom for about 15 years except some subbing. And he said, well, where are your credentials? I said, gee, I might have some here, but I think they're in Madison. He said, okay, goodbye. Hung up, called me back about an hour later, and he said, you're on for tomorrow morning in a 9th grade English class. They still had 9th grade at the elementary school down here. I said, oh. So I went back and I taught that class, and then one of the teachers took a sabbatical. I taught that for a little bit. And then one day they decided to give me a contract because I was there so much subbing. And I ended up being at Freedom Elementary School for 26 years under contract, and I taught, I think, every grade between 2nd and 6th, and then also that 9th for a while. I also worked with the dysfunctional families with the guidance department because I had the psychology minor. But then, of course, then they threw computers at it. So here I am back in school again, taking classes at night and in the summer through Viterbo College to learn how to use computers. Anyway, to make a long story short, I guess I was there for 26 years. I enjoyed every minute of it. I ended up in 2nd grade, and that's teacher's paradise. When I retired in 1996, I finished up in 2nd grade.
Margaret, you mentioned something about your teaching and restarting teaching and things like that. Could you bring us back up to speed on some more of your teaching experience?
Well, I only taught at the Oneida State Graded School with the Native Americans for 4 years, and then 1 year in Ohio, a suburb of Columbus, and then 26 years under contract at Freedom Elementary School. I did some subbing in a few other schools around. I went back to school to Oshkosh and got this minor in psychology, though when my children were younger, because I really knew nothing about raising children. And I had never babysat, I had never been able to stay over at anybody's house. I was an only girl, and anyway, our children grew up, and I think they matured well. But anyway, when our oldest daughter married or graduated from high school in 1974, I also graduated that same year for the last time from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. I even did the walk. I got a cap and gown, and I have pictures of that where I did the walk in 1974 as the last graduation. However, that Viterbo came in there later with computers, because when I finished teaching in 1996, I think I had 4 computers in my classroom. After starting out at St. Nick's with none of that kind of thing, through our high school years, none of that, and then into teaching, and to end up with the technology that we had at that time, it was just unbelievable. And I felt really grateful that I could be part of that, and that I could learn that, and that I could help children. My one statement I always made when I retired, I love children, my own, yours, and everybody else's.
Margaret Ann, if we could go back, okay, we're going back to a freshman in high school. Here we are at Freedom High School. Is Gene in the same class as you are?
No, Gina's a year older than I am.
Okay,
He also graduated from St. Nick's a year before me.
okay. So, interested in, you said before that you and Gene really didn't date in high school, but tell me about you and Gene's courtship and, how that all went.
Anyway, well, first of all, again, I mention my father often. My father was very protective of me. I was not allowed to date when I was a freshman, when I was a sophomore, when I was a junior in high school. My very first real date was for the senior prom when I was a senior. And that date was with one of my classmates. I knew Gene, but I didn't date him. We didn't travel in the same circles. He was a big basketball player, boxer, and all that kind of stuff. But during high school, I didn't date. The Nightingale was a big place for everybody to go to for dances and things. I was not allowed to go there even with my girlfriends until I was about a senior, I think. Once I was in college, once I went to county college, then we frequented the Nightingale very often. But Gene and I didn't have our first date until January 1st, 1951. He called me and asked me, and not for New Year's Eve, the day he called me and asked if I wanted to go out that evening on New Year's night.
Right.
So we did, and that progressed until we became engaged about a year and a half, 2 years later. But then we had a little rift in there, and we got unengaged. And then Gene went to the service. He joined the Air Force, joined for 4 years. And after our rift was over, somehow when he was home on leave once, we got back together and ended up staying together and getting married in 1955. So one of the best things that ever happened to me. I don't think that I could have survived the rest of my life unless that occurred.
So Gene, we've been through Margaret's story quite a bit by now, but now let's talk about Gene. Tell us about your ancestors, what you know about that to start with, and then we'll work our way chronologically to where Margaret stopped.
Okay. My grandpa's name was Chris, and his farm was right, well, we're on it right now, because it was right next door. And my dad was younger, and he was the youngest one in the family. No, I shouldn't say that. There were 10 in his family, but there's not many grandkids, but a lot of them get married. But he worked on the farm, and then before he got married, he used to date with Mom, and they used to take the horse and buggy, and they went to a lot of dances. 12 Corners, and they went to Nightingale and Wrightstown, they went all over. But then he worked in the mill in Kimberley, and we lived in Little Chute. And he worked there, he worked 6-hour days, 6 hours every day. And then Mom and Dad got married, and they lived in Little Chute. And then I was born in September 2nd, 1930, and my grandpa died in 31. Chris Randerson died in 1931. So I never knew him. I didn't know him anyway, but I knew my grandma. She used to come babysit every once in a while with a long dress on and hair and a pug, you know, like the old ladies always did. They always say old, but they, then Dad got sick of working at Kimberley Mill, and he bought the farm from his mother. And he bought it, but she had renters on there right that first year. So they were going to build a new house, because the house was old, original house. And you just had one light bulb down the middle, you know, each room. And so he bought the farm, and just before we moved out there, the barn burned. So then he had to put a new barn up before he put a new house up. But then we put both up. In 1941, we moved out here. And I was in the 5th grade, and I had one brother, Sherman, and he was at kindergarten. Then we went to, I went 1 year next door to the school in the 6th grade, and Mrs. Rodell was my teacher. Then she got married next year, she was Mrs. Crown. So I went 1 year to the 6th grade. I was the oldest one in school. There was no 5th graders. There was a couple 4ths, and a couple 3rds, and a couple 2nds, but then 3 or 4 years later they closed the school because they integrated. Then when I was in the 7th grade, I went to St. Nicholas. I had to make my solemn communion. Sherman had to make his first communion. So then I went to the 8th grade there, then I graduated, and we got interested. I went to high school then. There was nothing at high school, like for sports, we had practice during the daytime. There was nothing at night. When school closed at 3:30, everybody went home. And we had to do chores and everything else and do your homework, but otherwise, that's all there was. But I was boxing, and then I was basketball. Mr. Schrammel was principal, but he was our coach the first semester. Then they brought in Les Hyman. He was a coach for 2 years. Then Schrammel left, and when I was a freshman, they're halfway, and they had a Mrs. Kipp. She taught for a year and a half, and then Mr. Bockover came. And Mr. Bockover, then Les Hyman was done, and then Mr. Bockover was our coach for high school. And we didn't do anything else. I mean, there was no there was just basketball and boxing, and then when I was a senior, they quit boxing. So then we just had basketball. They started football the year after I left, but it was too late then, so. Then I stayed on the farm with my dad for 2 years or so, and then I couldn't take it anymore. Got engaged to Margaret, and then we didn't get engaged, and then I enlisted in the service, and I didn't want to farm anymore, so that's what it was. And when I came back from the service, I stayed home. I was going to farm, and I stayed there for a little while, and I didn't like farming. I didn't like the idea of, anyway, so I got a job at Appleton at Home Insurance Company, and I was there for about 15 years, something like that, and I would work at night at other places. I had 2 jobs. I'd come home and help my dad. So, and then finally I left Home Mutual and I went over to Paycon Corporation, Jerry Vanhoff's companies, and I worked there till I retired in '92. But I worked there. I also worked at HC Printing Company at night, part-time, sold shoes in the shoe department, and I helped my dad always until my dad sold the farm in '72, and he built a new house next door. And in the meantime, I was always here all the time with the kids and Margaret Ann, and we stay here all the time, but that's the way we've been, so.
Well, you guys you talk about being busy. So now you're working 2 jobs, you're helping your dad on the farm. Margaret Ann you're going to school in the evening time?
Sometimes.
During this time? And raising the family. Oh boy, wow.
I think some of that was instilled in us. Education was
Well,
a big part of our life.
well,
You
we were-
forgot to tell them about your education at business college, though, before you went to.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Okay, well that's all right. Let's back up. How about business college, Gene? Tell us about that.
okay, when I was getting on the farm, I was on the farm, and we were married, and I didn't want to farm. So I went to got a business college in Green Bay, and I went under the United States government, and I graduated from there, and that's when I got my job at Appleton, and I worked at Appleton, but I still helped my dad every night at the farm. In the morning, sometimes I had to get up in the morning and help milk and everything else, and we still had the farm, and
The farm, Gene, was a pretty good sized farm, wasn't it? There's a lot of acreage here, wasn't there?
well, when we were first on the farm, we had 80 acres.
Okay.
Then, when I was in high school, my dad bought 80 acres from the neighbors. And it all goes all the way down to the Holland Road. So we had quite a bit of land
So
then.
now you got 160
We had
acres.
160.
Yeah.
But then my dad sold 10 acres off right across the road for the pine trees here. And he sold some to Carol Warner, bought an acre or 2 west of us, right next to the school. But the school that I used to go to, that's a 2-room apartment now. Or at least it's 2 rooms, I don't know. They divided it in half and put someone in the back. And
Okay.
I never went back there. They got the cemetery up there, the Randerson Cemetery they call it. But they took the cemetery that was there, and all the stones were all there. We used to go and pick flowers all the time. But then after they got renters in there at the school, the renters had the kids, and the kids all put the stones in a pile, all the gravestones, and then we had somebody from the VFW coming to straighten out pretty good. The old road went through here. It went right in front of our house, right past the school, and it was a crooked road. It was a road from Green Bay. And 1957, they straightened the road out, but they couldn't do anything with the cemetery, so they put the road below the cemetery. And they used to go across the road, and the neighbors there on the corner down there, the road would come between the house and the barn. But they went around that now, they went behind they made a big circle there, and they changed it quite a bit, so.
Yeah.
That cemetery is now called Randerson Cemetery, you know.
Yes, yeah. And you're talking about the Burns farm where they would
Burns
come?
farm, yeah.
Yep. I remember the old road
We used to
myself,
come from
actually.
Seymour on C, and then you go right, there was no stop sign, there we had stop, but you went right straight, right through the house,
Yep.
and you come out around here.
Yep,
But now they got C, you stop, but then you gotta turn to the right, there's no road between the house and the barn now, you go. Oh yeah, it used to be a crooked.
so now, guys, we're raising a family. Margaret and Jean are married. You guys are doing all this stuff. Now we're having our children. You said you had 6 children in 7 years, did you say, Margaret?
Correct.
Oh my gosh. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, there must be some highlights to that you'd like to share.
Well, my dad had the farm here, and at night, in the wintertime, we had a snowmobile. And we've got a snowmobile, and we've got a sled that went behind it. The kids that come home from school, two would get on the snowmobile, 2 would get in the sled, and 2 would stand behind the sled. They had a place where you could stand, like an old Eskimo sled.
Yeah.
And down the 80 acres down here, they used to go round and around and around. I'll bet you they go a couple hours. And then they come in and then they'd do their homework. And then it was time to go to bed. Right? There was nothing, they didn't have anything after school, you know, when school quit, when school closed up, that was it. They didn't have any. Well, it was all girls, I mean, they didn't have much, well, one boy, but,
Well, all of them went to St. Nick's, first of all.
Okay.
you know,
So you had 5
5
girls
girls
and
and a
1
boy.
boy. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And they all went to St. Nick's. When Mary was in the 8th grade, Barb was in 1st grade. So they were all in school. They were all at St. Nick's the same year. And it was eventful and uneventful. They were involved in whatever went on at school. Church was a big part of our life. St. Nick's was a big part of our life. And they were good students. They all went on to Freedom High School. We used to threaten them if they didn't live by our rules and not the rules that kind of went around town. This was kind of the beer drinking area, you know. If they didn't comply with our rules, we used to threaten to send them off to some private school. But anyway, they all grew up and went through there and went on to be college graduates, all of them, and to this day they're really good. I don't know, we had the little children's illnesses. We were never stricken with anybody that passed away among our children. Anything like that, which a lot of people experience. I said, again, I think the good Lord is...
Not even any broken bones? What with the snowmobile riding and stuff?
Not much of anything.
No.
Some stitches, but I don't remember anybody being in a cast for anything. No broken legs, and they played in the trees. They were over at the farm, and they were over at my brother's farm and different things, but they had a great fun childhood, I think. We had a lot of friends who had big families too. And, us with 6 children, nobody else wants you to visit, right? So our friends that had big families, we'd all get together here sometimes, and the kids would go out and play in the snow, or in the summer they'd go out and play outside, and then we'd feed them hot dogs or whatever, and then everybody'd go home. And while they were doing that, we'd play cards. In the winter, I can
we'd go to
remember...
different houses. 'Cause
And
they
then the
had,
next Sunday, maybe we'd go to another house where they had a big family. It was always the Greenwoods or the Greens, Ronnie and Betty Gertz. They all had 6, 7 kids, and that's what we would do. We'd go around to those houses and we'd play cards, and the kids would play, and everybody'd eat, and then everybody'd go home and put them all to bed or whatever. Even when they were smaller, when Jean would be at work, sometimes us women would get together with the little kids, and we'd let them play together, and then give them lunch, and then take them home, put them to bed, and by the time that their dads got home from work, wherever they worked, they were ready to visit with the parents. We always had dinner in the evening as a family. I can't remember Jean being gone ever at that time. Maybe once or twice that he had something going on that he wouldn't be. He was always up in the morning, sometimes to milk, then to the office, then home, eat dinner, and then go to work at Prangy's or someplace. I mean, he was always here, and he was always helping with the discipline. Our kids they could never leave anything laying around in their rooms or anything like that, because he would check it out. He was a big help. I could have never done that without him. So, but the kids had a nice, normal, fun, they'll say fun-filled childhood. They had some restrictions. There were some things that they weren't allowed to do that other kids were allowed to do, some at certain ages and things like that. We were always, and I know that they did some things that we didn't know about. We hear things now that they did that we didn't know about. And even when they went off to college, then we hear even different things that they did that we didn't know about. And then we had what? We had 6 weddings. They came right in a row. You know, all of a sudden they're all out of school and working and whatever, or getting married. And so now we've got, you can see behind us, if you ever pan that picture, the 6 kids are there. And Mary is married and has 6 children. She's a registered nurse and works in ICU at Apple Medical Center. She's married to Marv Talbot, and he's an over-the-road trucker. And Tom is married to Jane Conklin from the Chicago area, and they have 2 children, Kate and Ed, and Tom has been with John Deere and Company ever since he got out of college. He's finishing up over 30 years and travels a lot for them now. In fact, just got back from Siberia. He travels all over the world for them. Joanne married Scott Pecor and had 2 children, and she lives in Fox Point, now in Milwaukee. And Maureen married Dan Vandenhavel from Little Chute, and now Combined Locks, and they have 3 children. Patty married Randy Peters, who she met at St. Norbert's when she was going there, and they have 2 children, and they live down in Hubertus. Randy has his own business, and our youngest daughter Barb married Tommy Garrett's, Shorty and Anita Garrett's youngest son from the DX and Freedom, and they live here. Our oldest lives here, the youngest, and Tom and Barb have 4 children. And now these grandkids, they're going high, wide, and handsome too. We've got college kids, we've got high school kids, we've got very few in grade school anymore. Our oldest grandchild is a girl, is a doctor. We've got Tom's son is in medical school. I don't know, the other ones are in business or whatever. I could go through every one of them that's got a career because they've got good college educations, and the high school kids are still doing fine and playing sports, and and then we've got one in grade school, 10-year-old. Our little 10-year-old Gracie is the daughter of Patty and Randy, and she's a Trinity Irish dancer out of Chicago and Milwaukee, and she has just recently been, in the last year and a half, she's been to Scotland, she's been to Ireland, and she is headed for London in the spring, and they're grooming her to dance over there, and she's been taking all kinds of medals and trophies all over the country. So that's another thing that was a part of our family. Jean and I always loved music. We loved to sing, we loved to dance. We sang in the church choirs. Jean sang with the Valley Air Barbershoppers for years. Our kids all took musical instruments. Our kids all took dancing lessons. I don't know, music has been a real big part and a fun part of our life. Gene was probably the best dancer of all the guys around, so that was a big attraction. His mother taught him to jitterbug in the kitchen over there. And I think that as I look at all of our friends, I think he's probably the only one that can probably still do it if his legs hold out. So.
What a time it must have been when the kids were in college. Financially, Gene, that had to be a huge obstacle for you to overcome. And I can't help but add a little bit to this statement. I mean, you mentioned your dad's, the importance he put upon education. Isn't it amazing how that really permeated all the way through all the generations?
Well, like we said, Gene had 3 jobs most of the time, and then I think it was a blessing that I got called back into teaching. That came on right about the time that Mary was heading off to college, the oldest one, you know. So again, I just feel like through our life, the good Lord has been watching out for us.
Amen
and
to that.
Taking us through every phase that came up, and even now, our health is not so good anymore, but I think that we're enjoying the kids, the grandkids, the great-grandkids, and everything that we ever did. And we don't really fight a lot.
You got all over that when the engagement
was a
got
long
broke off, Gene, right?
How many great-grandchildren?
We have 10 great-grandchildren. Colin is the oldest, it is 10, and he's Colin Schmitz, he's 10, and then Kaylin Richmond lives out in Denver, and she's 7. Bryce Schmitz is 7 also. Colin, Bryce, Carter Schmitz is 2. Then we've got 3 new great-grandchildren that came last spring within 6 weeks. We've got Lincoln Talbot belongs to John, and he has a sister, Eva, that's 3. Logan Richmond belongs to Dina, and he has the sister that's 7, Kaylin. And Elliot Betcher belongs to Melissa and her husband, and she has a sister 3 years old. So there's
Then
What?
it's 3
and,
youngest
and
ones.
then we have Demi Lynn Collins. It belongs to Maggie. So there's Colin, Bryce, Carter Schmitz, Kaylin and Logan Richmond, Eva and Lincoln Talbot, Harper and Elliot Betcher, and Demi Lynn Collins. So
The 3 youngest ones were all baptized at St. Nicholas. In
Okay.
Ju-
in the
July.
same, the whole Mary and Marv Talbot's whole family got together for a family reunion because one lives in Denver, and they brought all those babies back to freedom that were born in the spring, and they asked Father Felton if they could have them all baptized here. So on a Sunday at 10:30, all the families were here for a triple baptism for those
Oh,
great
okay.
grandchildren. Which it just makes us feel so good that that they're bringing them back here. Basically, that they're following a Christian faith, and many of them within their Catholic faith that they were brought up in. If we'll always have that, we don't know, but and it doesn't really matter. But they have all been a great joy to us. I think that's why we smile a lot, because they're a great joy. And those great grandkids too. They're all perfect. There's not a thing wrong with any of them. We were always afraid of diabetes, of course, because there's diabetes in both families. Jean's brother Sherman was diabetic, my brother was diabetic, died young, and we have not even been afflicted with that yet. So with 19 grandchildren, 10 great-grandchildren, and our own 6 children, health-wise, I can't think of anything big issue. There are some small issues that come up, but nothing big. So.
Well, guys, we're kind of winding this thing up. One thing, it's appropriate really that you sit in that love seat together. Tell us about that love seat that you're sitting in, Margaret.
Well, this is one of 7 pieces of furniture that belonged to my grandmother Garvey, Margaret Conlon. During her lifetime, this was her living room furniture. There's this settee, there's another one. I have a rocker, an armchair, and 2 straight chairs throughout our house that we've had redone and put into our own home here. This furniture was purchased somehow through Chicago, brought to freedom to her house over on the family farm, and it was there. I was born into it. My grandma Garvey died in the year before I was born, so this furniture is way over 100 years old. I never knew her, but now have inherited her furniture and have restored it to be in our house.
Well, I'm sure she'd be very happy
So.
to know what happened to her
So
love
anyway,
seat.
I understand she was a wonderful person, and she was always known as Granny, okay? She was Granny Garvey. And just by accident, because when we had our children, his mother was still living, and she was Grandma Margaret. My name being Margaret, I ended up being Granny.
Oh, well,
Just like my grandmother, and to this day, I am still Granny. And all of our kids' friends and the grandkids' friends will say, "Oh, there's Granny." It kind of came down through Granny Garvey.
As we close here, guys, I'm going to put you on the spot. One question comes to my mind. If you're to give married people advice on the ups and downs of life, and a little bit of, what's the word I'm looking for, motherly or fatherly advice, why don't you share that with us? Tell us, what life has taught you.
Well, on my perspective, I mean, no marriage is perfectly, compatible all the time. But I'm thinking that the young people do not give their marriages a chance. Even if you have arguments, if you have problems, if you have troubles, if you have things that come up, share that with each other, work through it. Don't be ready to give up very easily. And my thing is, keep God as the center of your family.
Gene, that's kind of a hard one to top, but you got a few words of wisdom you want to share?
Well, it's about the same. I mean, you gotta be together all the time, and if you have your arguments, get over them and love each other. That's what you gotta do.
Well, you guys are to be commended. I mean, your story is fantastic. To think of, here's Gene and Margaret. Now, 50, how many years?
We're married 57 years. Gina's
57
83
years.
and I'm 82.
I mean, yeah, that's right.
What a story. What a story. Thank you for sharing that with us today. So, Margaret, what are you doing these days? And Gene, I know you were real big in the Valley.
Valley Airs is
Valley
a barber
Airs.
shop.
Tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing right now.
Well, since retirement, we spend a lot of time with our children, with our grandchildren, any of their events. We have a cottage at Kelly Lake, which has been in his family for 50 years. And after I retired from the public school, I signed on at St. Nick's to teach religion for 10 years in the Faith Formation program. I also volunteer at Appleton Medical Center. I work about 2 or 3 days a month. I do patient advocate and I work the desk. I was also on the volunteer board of directors for 6 years since I've been retired. I also volunteer with the Freedom Area Historical Society, and I'm now in my 3rd term on the board of as vice president on the board of directors for that group. And otherwise, we anything that comes up at St. Nick's, we try to do as much as we can for anything that's going on there, as far as supporting their efforts and working if it's a possibility for the occasions that they have. So, other than that, it's pretty much family.
And I retired in 1992, and I joined the Fox Valley Air Barbershop course. And I was with them till about 2 years ago. I retired from there. That was long enough. So,
Yeah.
but that was every week. You go every week to sing, and you had lots of practices. I mean, at home was practice and everything else. It was another job almost.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's
But you went
More
around the
is-
country singing too.
Today is December 16th, 2013. We're back at the home of Gene and Margaret Randerson, and we're doing a bit of a sequel, an add-on to the original video that we did a month or so ago. We're going to start today with Gene and a little bit more about Gene's family, specifically his brother Sherman, who we didn't talk much about last time. Sherman has academic accomplishments extraordinaire, so to speak. And so, Gene, would you tell us about your brother Sherman?
Well, Sherman was born in 1935. He's 5 years younger than I am. And he went to St. Nick's. Well, he was born in Ulster first. And then he moved out here, and we went to school next door the first year. And then he was going to make his first communion, and I was going to make my solemn communion. So we went to St. Nick's in Freedom. And we went to school ever since. And he graduated from St. Nicholas the same as I did. And then he went to Freedom High School, same as I did. And he graduated in 1953. Then he went to St. Norbert's. He finished at St. Norbert's. And then he went to University of Detroit. And he got his doctor's degree there, master's degree. Then he went to University of Stout. And he taught there for a while, and he went back to the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And then he got a job at teaching at Oshkosh, University of Oshkosh, and he's taught there ever since. And he died when he was 54 years old, and it just so happened that I was over in Africa with my daughter and son-in-law, two of us and son-in-law, and we got the word that he died. And we couldn't do much about it. We couldn't come home right away. Another 3-4 days before we could get home, our passports wouldn't let us. And then when we got home, well, and that's all there was. Sherman was all done. And
Okay,
So-
Sherman spent much of his life studying, traveling, teaching at various universities in Wisconsin. He was a doctor of genetics. He also did much research in genetically caused diseases and the treatment of those. He had published numerous papers with other doctors of genetics about things that would affect all people in their lifetime. Sherman was very social and stayed very close to many of his high school graduates. He loved to visit, he loved to spend time with them, he'd invite them to our cottage. He loved to dance. Both Jean and Sherman were very, very good dancers. They could do the best jitterbug and waltz that you ever saw, and they were taught by their mother in the kitchen at their farmhouse.
Okay.
Sherman stayed very close to his friends from childhood and high school. He never outgrew his friends from freedom, although he traveled the world and studied and taught all over the place. But he would come back here and spend many, many hours of fun and visiting with those people and inviting them to the cottage at Kelly Lake also. Some of his friends that are still living today will tell about the great times they had with him and how entertaining he was and how down to earth he was, even though Sherman was a brilliant man.
Jean and Margaret, we've heard a little bit about the Kelly Lake Cottage, and Jean, you explained that your mom and dad bought that way back when, just a little bit. But from what we hear, there's a lot more to tell about Kelly Lake. Can you share some of the Kelly Lake experiences with the kids growing up and those kind of things?
Well, Jean's folks bought the cottage at Kelly Lake over 50 years ago when we had children all under the age of 7. And his parents went up there and they happened to see this old cottage for sale and they thought maybe that they would buy it specifically to entertain our children and to have them have some great recreation. Half of Kelly Lake was inhabited with old cottages, the other half was still woods. Margaret and Lee took Jean up there and they walked in the water, all in different parts of the lake, to see where the water would be the best and the shallowest and the most safe for the children. So instead of buying property on the part that was not inhabited and build a new cottage, they bought this little old cottage. And it had 2 bedrooms, curtains on the doors, 1 little bathroom, a porch, and a living room and a kitchen. So starting then over the years, our children and Jean and I, and of course his folks and his brother Sherman, spent many, many, many summers up there. We'd stay for a week at a time, weekends at a time. Jean would come home and go to the office and work, and I would stay up there with the children. Over the years, the children swam. They learned to drive speedboats. They did skiing. They would love to have what we called lunch cruises on the pontoon boat, where we would pack like a picnic basket when they were little, spread out their towels on the floor of the pontoon boat, and they'd eat their peanut butter sandwiches as we cruised around the lake. This was a highlight of their lives as they were growing up. They also met many dear friends up there. They became, as they got older, they became part of a group called the Naiads Ski Club, and that was with a lot of the kids from the lake, and they put on shows on 4th of July and probably Labor Day to entertain people around the lake. Also, a highlight of that was that Tom Randerson met his wife Jane at Kelly Lake, and they've been married for about 31 years, so that was a very, very nice thing that happened at Kelly Lake. They played games inside and outside, in the water and out of the water, had cookouts, and as they grew up and got married, then it was a place for all of the married couples and the cousins. And the cousins, they call themselves the cousins actually, and at this point they have their own private spot on an email that no one else can get into, that they converse with. They became so close to each other because of Kelly Lake, and we can thank Margaret and Lee, Jean's folks, for giving us that. Then when Jean's father passed away and his mother was old, she said to Jean she didn't think that she wanted it anymore, and he was the only person in the family left to take it over, so she gave it to him. I don't even think you gave her $1 for it. She gave it to him, and we spent some years there, but then before she passed away, Jean decided to ask our family if they would use the cottage if he built a new one. Or were they all going to separate into their own families and children and go on and have their own places? And they said no. They would come if we built. It was kind of like, you build it, we'll come. Although our son and his wife are most of the time down at her family's cottage, which is also on Kelly Lake. So Jean retired in 1992 and promptly started to tear down that cottage and build a new one. 1993, while he was in the process of having it built, he had a heart attack. Kids used to laugh and call it cardiac cottage because of that. Anyway, the contractors were very good, and they promised by tearing it down in the fall that they would have us back in the new one by Memorial Weekend. And even though Gene had had his heart attack, they did do that. They had us in the new one by spring. Across from our cottage, the old cottage and the new one, on the corner was a place called the Round Roof. After our children were all tucked in bed at night and everything, all of the excitement was over for the day, Gene and I spent many an evening with his parents, and then afterward, when they were gone, socializing and dancing. Gene and I love to dance. We can do a very good jitterbug, even maybe yet with our weak legs and a beautiful wall. Gene and I have traveled with our children and without our children to about 47 of the 50 states. When our children were young, we would load them up in the station wagon. No seat belts. They didn't even hear of those at that time, and we would head off to various places. We've had our children in New York City. They've been to the top of the Empire State Building. We've had them at Niagara Falls. They have been to Florida numerous times, down the Gulf side, up the ocean side, as far down as Key West and into the Panhandle. We have traveled with them they've been to Disneyland, Disney World, they've been to Canada, to Mexico, and to Washington, D.C., where we rode the trams and they were able to tour the city of Washington. Sometimes Gene and I traveled just by ourselves, sometimes we took the whole family. I would like to mention one very memorable trip that we had to Florida when we stayed at Ormond Beach, which is on the ocean side, just north of Cape Canaveral. And as we sat on our balcony one evening, we heard this roar. And we didn't really know that it was going to happen, but the earth began to shake. And all of a sudden we saw the Endeavour take off to space. We sat on that balcony and watched it out of sight. It looked like a great big long orange school bus of fire. And we watched it till it faded out of sight and became just a star. It still makes my hair on my arms stand up because that was just a very memorable part of one of our vacations. We took our last full family trip with all of the 6 children in 1974. It was the year that Mary graduated from Freedom High School and I re-graduated again from the University of Wisconsin in Oshkosh. So we decided to take one last trip before she was off to college and whatever. The children were always good travelers. They played games in the car. We had something that looked like bingo cards that they could play games of cars they were seeing, license plates they were seeing, states we were going through. They always had a road map that they could follow. If they got tired, we would have them lay down in the back of the station wagon where the seats were down, but their heads had to be bumped up against the front seats because we thought if we got rear-ended, they wouldn't get hurt as badly as Gene was driving from all over the country with them. So all in all, our trips with our children were very pleasurable, and we were very fortunate, and God blessed us with safety. I don't know that we could ever say that any one of them got hurt or we had to visit a hospital or anything like that. Probably the worst thing that happened was when Tom Randerson's contacts blew out of his eyes into Niagara Falls. In 1984, our son-in-law, Dan Van Havel, married to our daughter Maureen, worked for the big company Price Waterhouse as an accountant or CPA, and he was assigned to Johannesburg, South Africa, to be the accountant for a place called Sun City in South Africa, which is like Las Vegas. I was a bit concerned, well, the family was concerned that we were going to be very lonesome for Maureen. So before they left, we decided that we would take a trip together, that we would, the four of us would go to the United Kingdom. Because the trip over to South Africa would involve going from Chicago to New York, to London, to the Verde Islands, and then to South Africa. So anyway, Maureen and Dan left from Chicago on one flight and flew into Heathrow Airport in London. Jean and I left from the Chicago airport and we flew into Gatwick Airport in London. We took the Gatwick Express to Victoria Station where we met up with Dan and Maureen, and we could walk to our hotel in London. We spent 1 week in London touring all of the things you might think of in London. We visited Buckingham Palace, we visited Windsor Palace, we went to the cathedrals, we fed the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, we rode the double-decker buses, we rode the tube, we went to the cathedrals. After a week of, and we also went to the Tower, which is on Tower Bridge, where they lock up the Queen's jewels. So we watched the Beefeaters one night take care of locking up the jewels. We spent many days, we spent the whole week there viewing and seeing everything we could in London. When that week was up, then Jean and Dan rented a car, and we started out and visited. We went to Birmingham, where Jean's company did business with a company there, and we visited them. We went to Wales, we saw Stonehenge, we went to the heated water in Bath. We ended up going over to Holyhead, putting our car on a ferry to cross the Irish Sea, and we went to Dublin. When we were pulling in with this ferry into Dublin, there were big gunboats with their guns facing out across the Irish Sea because there was much unrest in Ireland at that time. So anyway, we got to London, got to Dublin, got our car off of the ferry, and then began touring Ireland. We went straight across from Dublin to Westmeath, across to Galway, down around the Dingle Peninsula, down to Cork, where many of our ancestors had left many, many years ago to come to the United States. We went to the crystal factories. We went to a nunnery where the nuns made lace in Killarney. One of the highlights of it, I thought, was when we climbed to the top of Blarney Castle and kissed the Blarney Stone. We left Ireland by way of the south and crossed the English Channel and went back to London, and then Maureen and Dan left from Heathrow to South Africa. Jean and I left again from Gatwick and came back to the United States. Because of this trip and the 2 weeks we had spent together, I always felt like Maureen was on vacation, so I really didn't feel lonesome for her. We could always talk to each other by phone, but they spent 3 years there and then returned home in 1987. During the years that they were there, many of the family members visited South Africa. Some went on hunting safaris, some went on just sightseeing safaris. Jean and our youngest daughter Barb took a trip in 1987, just about the time that Maureen and Dan were going to return to the United States. And they spent some sightseeing days there and came back to the United States. And Maureen and Dan took a trip around the world on their way home, and then came back to the United States, and they settled in Mequon. They were gone for they were married for about 10 years before they were ever back settled in Wisconsin, and didn't have any family. And then they started their family and had their first little girl. Ariana was born while they were in Mequon. Said we were very happy, overjoyed, the whole family was, to have them back in the United States.
Okay.
So now, Jean and Margaret, we've talked about these international trips and all of these auto trips with the kids. Tell us about your retirement dates and your retirement years, after the kids were gone. A little bit about that.
Okay, Jean retired in 1992, and I retired in 1996. And after we were both free, we started going to Arizona. We went to Sun Lakes, Arizona for 10 years. We would go by car the first few years when we could carry along our golf clubs, our clothes, other things that we might need while we were out there. We stayed at a place called Sun Lakes, which was a gated community. Our landlords were Joyce and Rich Featherstone. And what they had, when they moved out there, they built a home in Sun Lakes. And Joyce's mother was old, so they built what they called a mother-in-law's quarters for her. It was called Kate's Place. And of course, Joyce's mother passed away, and just through some mutual friends, we heard that they were renting out Kate's Place. So that was what we rented. We rented Kate's Place. It was a little, like, one-room apartment. It had a great room, a bathroom, a closet, and a microwave, refrigerator, and things like that. So for 10 years, we rented that. And while we were there, it was right on a golf course. We could go out the door and we could watch the golfers, or we could play golf there. We could use the patio. We could use the grill. We could invite friends over. Some of our friends would come out there at the same time, and they'd come over and they'd golf with us, or they'd have dinner with us, or we played a lot of bridge. Gene and I are both bridge players, and I play individual ladies bridge, and he plays couples bridge. While we were out there, we did a lot of that. We spent 10 years coming and going until the last year we went, Gene got ill out there. And on the day that we were supposed to come home, he had a stroke. I thought we should go to the hospital. He thought we should go and board the plane. So our landlord, Rich Featherstone, took us to the airport, and we got him in a wheelchair, got him up to the gate, and I told the gate attendants that he had had inner ear infection. That's why he was in the wheelchair. However, he had already had a mild stroke. We got him on the plane, got him to Chicago, got him back to Appleton. Our family met us there and took Gene to Theta Clark Hospital, where he spent 2 weeks under therapy and stroke treatment. And that ended our 10 years of vacations in Arizona. We had much, much fun out there. We did a lot of golfing, dancing, card playing, eating, and just socializing. It was a great part of our life for the first 10 years after we were retired.
Gene and Margaret, talking about all your vacations that you took, I know you took one last international vacation you told me a little bit about back in 2001. And so would you tell us about that vacation? And then we're going to have a little, what we're going to call a potpourri time, where there's no structure to this. You just tell us little things that happen to come to your mind, and with that we'll close today's taping. So tell us about the vacation in 2001.
Well, in 2001, as we all know, that was the terrible thing that happened in New York on 9/11. We had planned a trip to visit 7 countries in Europe. Because of 9/11, most of the people that were on our tour had decided not to take that trip. But Gene and I discussed it, and he said, well, we're going anyway. So we flew to Europe, and we met up with the tour guide. We visited the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, France, Italy, and Venice, and everything in between. While we were in those countries, we had many, many great experiences. In the Netherlands, we visited a working windmill, which was exciting, and my maternal ancestors are from the Netherlands, so that was exciting. In Germany, we were fortunate enough to visit our nephew, Joe Garvey, and his wife Sarah, and their 2 children. He was working over there for 3M at that time. So we met them on the patio at the Cologne Cathedral and had lunch with them. They brought a picnic lunch. We moved on to Austria, Switzerland. In Switzerland, we took a ride up the Swiss Alps. In France, we went dancing in the streets of Paris during it was some kind of a carnival going on. In Italy, we were very, very lucky to be able to visit the Vatican. and we have pictures of us in front of the Vatican at Rome. We went to Venice, rode the little boat, the gondola I believe they call it, and were serenaded while there. This particular trip took us through the Black Forest, on the Autobahn, and a short cruise on the Rhine River where we saw many, many historical places from the wars. There were so many things that happened on that trip that it's almost too numerous to mention. And while we were there, we had a wonderful tour guide. She also took us to Monaco, and we were able to visit where Princess Grace was married. She gave us an hour to go to the casino there and gamble. We looked down at the Mediterranean, at the big yachts, and saw Prince Rainier's yacht down there. At that time too, there were also nude bathers on that beach on the Mediterranean. We walked for hours. We toured everything, cobble streets, castles, museums, cathedrals, almost anything that you can think of that would be historical in those 7 countries. I cannot tell you what a wonderful, wonderful time that was, and we were so happy that we went. When we were finished, our tour guide said, "Did you ever feel unsafe while you were here because of what the situation was in the world?" And we said, "No, we never felt unsafe." And she said, "You know, I grew up over here, and I have lived my life with war going on in one country or another." And she said, "We just go about our business and live our lives as best we can as normal people." And she said, "I'm happy that none of you ever felt unsafe while you were here." Over the years, we have also belonged to the Fox Valley Golf Course for 15 years, where Gene was an avid golfer, a very good golfer, where I was just a mediocre golfer with the ladies once a week. And during that time, he golfed on many other courses in Wisconsin with business associates, and he had the honor or the expertise of having a hole-in-one in Oshkosh at West Haven Golf Course when he was there on an outing with some of his business associates. Gene has also always been very proud of his yard and the flowers and whatever, and he spends many, many hours of our retirement working with that and doing the things that require making your home and your yard look beautiful. He's an avid reader, and he's also very, very attached to his TV. He follows all the sports, those of the national, college, high school, our grandkids, and everybody else's. We spend many hours reading and just sitting with each other and watching TV and talking to our children. And I spend a lot of time on my iPad sending emails and conversing with our children. And I also continue to volunteer at Appleton Medical Center, where I'm a patient advocate, and I work the East Care Pavilion Tower computer, giving out room numbers and running errands and transporting patients and things like that. I'm also still active with the Freedom Area Historical Society, serving on the board as vice president. Other than that, our days are spent relaxing, reading, watching TV, reminiscing about the old days, and spending time with our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren.
As the interviewer, I should introduce myself. I'm Mike Randerson, and I had the honor of actually serving Mass at Margaret and Jean's wedding, and talk about ironic situation. How fun it is to listen to their life story since that time. Thank you very much for your interview with us, Margaret and Jean.